Hey, this is Steve Mayeda with Sexuality.com, and this is a TSL Evolution podcast with a gentleman by the name of Socrates. You can find out more about Socrates at manningupsmart.com. Also, you can watch his videos with the 21 Convention. He's got a bunch from there, so go to 21convention.com, go to manningupsmart.com, find out more about him, and join the movement with TSL Evolution, bringing the principles and the philosophy of TSL into life in total. Enjoy. All right, guys, what's happening? It's Steve Mayeda from Sexuality.com, and this is a TSL Evolution call. And what these are calls that are geared really to a movement of public awareness and just to get the message out there that what we believe in with TSL, which stands for the sexual life, is an overall philosophy, a set of principles and methodology based on that. That overall philosophy is that we were born to be sexual. There's no shame in it. We are animals that are meant to have these urges and feelings that influence our physical bodies, our emotions, our mentality, and that we're living beings. We're meant to express ourselves. And the only way to do that is through authenticity, through the belief and connection. You know, we really believe that with sex, it's two different things coming together, and in that transformation, it can make a new thing. You know, literally, like in my life right now, I'm sitting right next to my beautiful partner, Maria, who's pregnant. So there's that aspect of it where a new physical life is being made. But even if I connect with somebody else at the minimal, and I don't even want to call it the minimal level because it's a beautiful thing, but if I connect with somebody, then we have a new thing, a new relationship, a new set of emotions, a new set of ways of thinking, you know, the evolution of thought, the progression, and yada, yada, yada. Man, I really believe that, you know, sex is something that we're born to do. We're born to be sexual, we're born to be social, and we were meant to live life and express it. And that is the voice we're carrying with TSL Evolution, taking these ideas and philosophies into all of our lives. Some of those we're focusing on are our minds, our bodies, our hearts and emotion, our sex and sexuality, and our spirit. And that is how we progress as a human being. You know, the sexual life started out as something where it was like, hey, how can men, you know, talk to women better, have a better sex life, improve in all those different areas? But really, where it's turning into, and the vision of it is how we can become, you know, sexually happy, healthy human beings. So that being said, we have a pretty awesome guest who is joining us today. He goes by the name of Socrates, and man, I've first off, I didn't know who this guy was. He was a member of something called a group in Florida, uh, which was called the Top Layer. He spoke at the 21 convention, which rooted out of the Top Layer. I mean, this is the crazy thing about that, the Top Layer. And man, I remember when you spoke, I didn't see it. And a bunch of people told me later that day, they were like, man, the best speech was that Socrates guy. And I'm like, who the fuck is that? And so then after that, at the
Well,
many conventions,
considering the speakers, that's incredible. I mean, it really was. I was on stage with people. You said that and go, well, you know, you just have to pinch yourself and go, what? You know, I'm speaking with whom? You know, so that was quite an honor.
you know what's crazy is actually my old roommate, Phil. We've traveled the world together. We've hung out. He lived with me. Um, that was his first 21 convention that he went to. I forget the year that you had first spoken at, and
Hmm.
you know I was pretty tight with him. You know, we were pretty close, and he was like, "Dude, man, this Socrates dude. I mean, he brought it down." And I was like, "Well, what do you mean? You know, what he gave you some techniques on dating or whatever?" And he's like, "No, no, no. It was all about being a man." And yeah, like how did this all come about? You know, how did
Well,
you find your place in this world of self improvement, being a man, all that stuff?
yeah, to be really honest, it was through making massive, massive mistakes, suffering horribly because of them, and honestly, being accountable to my own actions and realizing that, you know, I would be so easy to blame things on other people or, you know, other instances, but to realize that you were a very integral part to what I had done, the relationship structures that I developed, who I chose, why I chose them, the things that I saw and didn't see, or more importantly, saw and ignored. and then to sit down and say you had a choice in this, and what were the lessons that you learned. And I wanted to improve myself. I had already started even previous to that, where I kind of lost sense of myself, and I wanted to go back to a time period in my life in which I really excelled. And I had, several great examples, whether it was in architecture school or my time in the military, and to sit down and say, what was I doing when I felt the best by myself? When was I succeeding the most, regardless of the adversity I faced? And it was during those time periods. And so I very intentionally went out to collect a group of men and individuals that were looking to improve their lives in particular ways, very much like steel sharpens steel, men sharpen other men. And so I intentionally went out to find people like that and to become friends and associate with and share ideas. And I ended up discovering the top area in Orlando through part of that, and have developed some, just some very lifelong relationships because of it. Guys that I'm very still close with. Anthony's one of them. There's several others. Interestingly enough, several of them are former 21 speakers, and just some phenomenal guys. And then kind of as you kind of progress through that, you teach and share the information, and you start to becoming a mentor for others, and a kind of a role model, whether intentionally or not. And then I had a choice. You don't have to lead, but it was a choice for me. And I made the step forward to say, okay, I'm going to take on kind of the responsibility and put some more information out there, work with some of these guys specifically, and then to share that information. And because of that, I was asked to give a talk at the 21 convention, which then spurred it even more. And that was kind of the spring point for the blog, was to kind of really document my thought process on relationship development, starting with yourself, and then also starting with understanding the context of the social and political environment of the dating culture that we live in today, and to kind of look and carry things forward and saying, look, what are you going to do if this is kind of the direction you want to go in your life? How do you prepare yourself? And so that's kind of the section of the blog. And each blog post covers a specific section or specific topic and idea, and they're compartmentalized, very much like a book is. And so I'm kind of probably 3/4 of the way through that process, but that's kind of my history in that, and that of course spanned well over 5 years to this point.
So that's an interesting
long
thing.
answer to a simple question.
No, it's good. It's good. And we love long answers here on these things, just because it builds the dialogue. It keeps things going. And also, there's a couple guys attending this call right now who are some really big heavy hitters that I know you guys are more than welcome to chime in at any time to ask Sock questions, because, or you could type it in the chat box if you want, because I know that, man, they're up there. They're up there with life experience, with the wisdom, this is all the stuff we're trying to do at TSLs. How do we become a better man through our experience in life, which is tough? I mean,
right? Yeah, it really is.
It was almost as if I came in like I wanted to have sex, and then somehow this man thing got dropped on my plate. Like, you got to be responsible, which is tough. And man, I mean, I'll tell you, consequences get high. But let's talk about this. This is, well, I'm sure we'll come back to all that sort of stuff. But man, your blog, I'm busy with my stuff. I'm always, doing something. I do a lot of calls. I do a lot of interaction with my group. I'm really big into, building a unity in a men's group. That's really what TSL is all about. We should broadcast it out more so that the public can hear it. But every once in a while, I come across a blog post by you that's either shared by you, shared by Anthony, or somehow comes up. I come across it, and man, it's fucking amazing. The level of insight and the way you break things down is so awesome. I am, first off, it comes from experience, but you're very technical, and the way you break things down is very efficient. And you mentioned that your blog is actually written like a book, and to navigate through it, if you know that, it makes it a lot easier to navigate. So how did you come up with that idea? And I guess, what would be a good starting place for guys who don't know anything about you to start at?
Probably the best starting point is to go to my website, manningupsmart.com, and then go to the table of contents. Because if you just go to the website, you're going to get the most recent posts. And they're written very specifically in order, covering subject matters. But that's not where the individual is at. The individual, I would assume, and in most cases has been always been the case, people know where they're at. And they just need to plug and play into where in the spectrum of relationships that they fall into, and then to be able to pick and choose the information they want based on the subject matter that interests them, not necessarily the format that I laid it out. But overall, I start with the premise that you need to understand the cultural environment in which we live, and then also the political context and their extreme disincentives for men to be in relationships. And you have to have a clear understanding of what's taking place. In many ways, guys will talk about that being red pill wisdom as opposed to blue pill, and that's true to a degree. I tend to take a little bit further because what we find is that behind culture we have laws that follow, or actually more specifically, behind culture we have politics, and that's the political beliefs of the cultural system starting to get ingrained in society, and then following the politics we have the laws, and in many cases they're very, very, very highly derogatory towards men. They're disincentivizing relationships for men. And if you honestly look at it, you'd be, I tell guys this, you'd be stupid to get in a long-term committed monogamous relationship, especially where children are concerned, as far as marriage. But I think ultimately we're biological creatures, and we're predisposed to do just that. And in this highly hazardous, environment, how do you do it? And so you have to prepare yourself. And one of the first things you have to do is prepare yourself specifically. You can't expect good things to come to somebody who isn't out there doing good deeds. And you have to have the relationship with yourself first before you can have one with someone else. And in the pickup community, there's an axiom that you attract at your own level, and that's usually with either skill or attractiveness traits. But the same thing's true for healthy relationships. You can only have a healthy relationship as healthy as an individual you are. And the less healthy you are, the less likely of having a healthy life and a lifestyle and relationship will become as possible, but highly unlikely. And the reverse is true too. Smart people that are terribly healthy with themselves make poor decisions, but they tend not to last, and they tend not to be devastating. So my first suggestion would be go to the website, check out the table of contents, see where you fit in specifically, what interests you, and then kind of pick and choose. But I would primarily point people to the cultural, social understanding of the geopolitics of the social culture today.
Man, you
kind of a very relevant one.
You brought up a lot of stuff, and I don't know where to start, but I'm going to start.
More than just one snowball.
What flagged me first was the cultural stuff, and you also ended on that. So let's go with that. I have this idea: we're meant to be sexual beings. We're meant to be sexual in any way, shape, or form. We're also meant to be communication beings. So in pickup, you always heard like that we're not meant to be monogamous. We're supposed to, have a lot of sex. Totally true. I absolutely agree with that. But just as big of an urge, we're supposed to, connect and socialize with each other. And I think it's important to, join the group, basically. But the group, when we were evolving, for hundreds of thousands of years, we've only had society a short time, was, 3 people, 10 people. I mean, it was small, and it wasn't generations. We weren't able to sustain that. So it was kind of like, hey, this little mini culture, this little mini community, we got to follow that. I think that is a huge urge. In our culture today, it's a distortion of that. We have too many people, we have too much stimuli, we have way too much shit going on. Then we get all these rules. But I'll tell you this, I feel our urge is to follow society. Man, I think there's plenty wrong.
And I think it's more than an urge. I think we're biologically, as animals, as strictly, how we talked about sexual urges, to actually couple. I know that, for example, that as males we're predisposed to spread our seed as immensely as we can, and women are the opposite of that, and that's biological. But we also have a very strong biological creation for chemical hormonal reactions associated with like oxytocin, serotonin, and these are coupling elements that are biologically driven. There's a reason why we respond to physical touch, and why in like a pickup community, kino is terribly important, because when you touch somebody, it sends off a hormonal response, a degree of oxytocin oxytocin, and a few others. And so you start developing these biological and hormonal connections with individuals. Sex is a very, very powerful one. The largest surge we can create is through an orgasm with an individual, and it's why so many guys go through these, stupid, sayings of "I love you" after having amazing sex and orgasms with a chick. Is that they're biologically driven and they're drugged to do it. They're induced, chemically and hormonally to do these things, and this sort of plays out in a number of ways. And so I think we're biological creatures sexually. I think we're biological creatures for relationships, and we've had truly a tremendous history on coupling. And you sit down and say, not only is it successful for thousands and tens of thousands of years, but it's global. It's not like this is a single cultural creation. This sort of makeup has been found on every continent throughout all civilizations and even preceding civilizational periods. Now, there have been competing forms of it, polygamy and several others, but the most successful for child-rearing society and civilization advancement has been the most simple, and that is a two-partner coupling. It reduces the energy expenditure, the communication connection, and everything else. And if you talk to real polygamists, they're exhausted. These are exhausted men, and they're not exhausted sexually. They're exhausted emotionally, having to deal with the emotional needs and the communication processes, managing and leading a intimate group that large. And so I think that, even while it exists, I don't think it's been typically terribly successful outside of a couple of very seed cultures that have embraced that.
Yeah, what's funny is when people talk
Am I flying
about
too far off the handle?
no. This is like totally. We talk about all this stuff all day long, man. When people and there again a lot of stuff you talked about, but man, number one is like when people bring up like wanting to run a harem or a group of women or whatever, they have not looked at uh, polygamous cultures because I really feel that the only way every PUA type person has tried to have multiple long-term relationships that basically got really involved in a good skill set and all that sort of stuff. Um, I know I have. The only way to do it is to make it your life, to
Right.
have everybody know, to have full communication there, and it is exhausting. It is.
Or the alternative is to the point that you just don't give a shit, that you just don't care if they're in or out. And the fastest road to actually accomplishing that is the social dimorphism of fame. If you can achieve a degree of fame and celebrity in it, you no longer have to do the work that mere mortal men do, with physical stature or social stature,
Well,
achievements, wealth, and all that.
the shitty thing about that is that everybody I know who's done that has had a bunch of other problems. I really think that like anyway, but in our culture, I think those are some ways to do it. But there have been
Right.
other cultures that have there have been other cultures that have accomplished this just the way their society works,
Correct.
whereas
Correct.
smaller tribal type whatever. But man, let's there's actually a couple questions already written in, and I don't want to throw it off track too much. But one question that was written in when you were talking about all this was, how can you be healthy while being natural? Some people get so rigid with the rules which can get in the way of being natural. So I suppose it's sex being natural, and the feelings of oxytocin being natural, the all those things, but then fitting into our culture, there's rules and all that sort of stuff.
Correct. And I think that the answer comes from within. It's hidden within the question itself. If you're going to be authentic and be happy with yourself, I think you have to live your own life within your own rules, and realize that all these other influences external of you are not necessarily authentic of you, and that if society is saying something and you're not happy with that or don't want that, the degree of separation between your values and society's, or whatever the external influence is going to be a measure of your initial basis of unhappiness. And I would sit down and say, you need to create your own life, and you need to create your rules for how you live, the structure and the context of it, by your own design. And that's living a very tailored life. There are going to be challenges to that, but I think you're going to be vastly happier pursuing those values than you'll ever be living under somebody else's you disagree with.
Well, hey, this is Rick, man. I got a question here then, because I wrote that question in. Like I see people who say, this is the healthy way. You need to do this. You need to lift. You need to exercise. You need to eat this way. You need to eat that way. You said earlier, the premise was you have to be, do these healthy things, be healthy to have a healthy life, which totally makes very ambiguous. And it could notice people like, dude, man, to be healthy, you got to sleep in, smoke a couple joints, and then catch that perfect wave, man. That's a perfect life. Man, if that's not healthy, if you're doing anything different than that. And other people that are so rigid about what a healthy life is, it's like, no, you can't eat that, or I don't eat that, or I won't have anybody around me that smokes. And it's just like really kind of segregates things. But nature, it's pretty natural, right? Rats are healthy. They just eat what and they have good sex and they survive, right, in a society where they're put. And so I'm kind of wanting to ask, and actually, even for you, how would you define that for you personally?
It's several things. When anytime you take advice or you're looking for advice, people are going to give it. And the problem becomes not the advice itself, but when you take it, you now assume ownership of it. And I have suffered from similar instances where I've taken, quote, good advice, mainstream, well-accepted advice that was not tailored to me. It was not tailored to what my intentions were, my objectives, and consequently, it was very poor advice. But the problem was I took it. And once you take it and you take that advice, it's now yours. You're accountable to it, and anything that comes from that. And in many ways, that's in some ways still playing out. The interview series for the documentary series of the 21 Convention, we filmed inside my house, and we actually filmed a Greg Swan as well, who came later. That house is very much a ramification of exactly that example I was giving you, where I took some general advice that was well accepted, well mainstream, but was not tailored to what I was wanting to do. And I still have that. And that's a financial burden in many ways. It's an emotional burden because I have now obligations, and I'm now very much tied and weighed down by it rather than being liberated from those sort of obligations. But at the same time, I've learned from it. So there's that. But I think in part you have to wear some of this stuff. If you kind of want to understand what Buddhism is, I think you kind of have to wear it for a while. I think you have to become a Buddhist for a little bit, if you really want to kind of feel and get an understanding for it. A lot of the guys from the 21 Convention are into biohacking and looking and trying different things, whether it's health, nutrition, exercise, and to try these things on, document what you're doing, whether it's journaling or whatever it is, and then compare it to your results and to see how close you held to a particular diet or nutrition program. Were you going off the rails because you were slightly off? Was that an effect? Or, for example, you look at it in my video weights, I'm not a healthy guy. I'm a large, overweight, highly stressed, highly inflamed guy. And if you sit down and say, I've been eating paleo, doing super slow workouts, doing all the things that, I know are healthy for me, why am I still this way? Well, what's my stress level like, and what's my sleep, quality and duration like? And they're off the charts wrong. And anytime those things happen, it's a toxic element to me, and I'm responding physically to that. When I get all those things in line, you see a dramatic change. So, and that's something that I'm on a very personal level that I'm working with, and I'm having to play through, and to sit down and say I'm eating primarily a high-fat diet right now is counter to what any doctor's probably going to tell you. And I sit down and I have to counter with the research and say, look, I understand science politically is saying this, but what's the research telling? You want to put me on a high inflammation diet based on grains and carbohydrates, when in fact I'm hyperinflamed. How smart is that? And they don't really know what to say other than, well, it's good nutrition. I'm like, well, according to who? Where's this coming from? And so you kind of have to do your own research. You have to kind of plug into this and then also see how you respond to it. I can say all day monogamy is a great thing, but if monogamy is not a great thing for you, God almighty, don't do it.
Well, let me ask you this then. I like what you said, right? And I like that you brought it back to who you are and what you do. And I get a sense, and I may be wrong, tell me if I'm wrong, but that you're living a healthy life, right? That your life is healthy, you're happy, you're kind of doing the things you want to do, even if you are eating a fatty diet or you are inflamed or you have a house that maybe you didn't want to buy, but you can still have a healthy life, right?
Yeah.
By health, like emotionally healthy, spiritually satisfying, that you're out there enjoying life and doing things, even though everything isn't perfect, right? Or am I?
Correct. Yep. Yep. Yeah, and in many ways, it's not necessarily having everything you want to be happy. It's actually having being happy with the things that you have. So for example, the house. And it's not just I bought the house. I designed the goddamn thing. And so this, it was a daily reminder that this is something I created. And probably the first thing that really I should have never have done is build that particular house. My original design intent was something much smaller, more economically viable. It would have been hyper cool anyways. I mean, I would have made sure of that. But it was not going to be this monstrosity geared for, a relationship and family and children and all these things, because, that's what I was, kind of the road I was going down to at the time. And it was also not meant for a lot of mass resale. And talking to real estate agents and people I knew, they're all saying, you've got to do a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, minimum this square feet, everything else, which was really grossly getting larger than what I ever needed or could honestly afford appropriately. And being creative and a problem solver, I solved those problems. Consequently, my debt-to-income ratio based on my take-home pay, probably about 74, 75%, my take-home pay is going to mortgage. That's insane. But that doesn't sit down and say that I cannot enjoy my life, the experiences that I have in it, even with all this stress. And, even though I'm in many ways scared shitless going forward, I'm alive. I'm very much alive. And the pickup community had a kind of a real nice action I use from time to time, is that there's no growth in the comfort zone. And I'm definitely not in a comfortable zone, but I'm growing in as an individual, as a person, as an architect, as kind of a mentor and a man, and and different things that I'm doing. But I'm also very much aware of the things that I don't know, and that kind of that spooks you. And so, but that doesn't necessarily say I stop or I stop enjoying the process and what I'm doing and why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I just make sure that what I'm doing is associated with why I'm doing it. And when those things aren't aligned, something needs to get rebalanced.
Let's actually go to this. Jim, before you jump in, let me just, and please jump in after I say this. Let's get to the qualities of a man. What is that? What is integrity? What is being responsible for yourself? Because that's something that comes up over and over again, whether it's a shitty relationship or a uh, man, you have kids, you buy property, whatever it is. How do we learn to be responsible for that in our society? And
Yep.
go ahead, Sock. I cut Jim off. Jim, ask your question after Sock replies to this. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, and obviously, taking a definition of what is a man, it depends on your cultural, viewpoint, kind of the standing, and there's probably several ways in which to do it. But I'm coming from that fairly sexist and traditional background in which you sit down and say, as a man, you need to have this ability to provide and protect. And I think on a biological level, women are acting out on that regardless of what their political beliefs are or cultural beliefs are. I think as men, we judge ourselves based on that. I think there's a lot of detriment to that, especially in this day and age in which that's not necessarily a requirement. And so, I think a lot of men don't feel like they're successful when, for example, they're not self-supporting. They're not able to care for themselves in a manner in which they, would want to or expect, let alone overproduce to the point that they could afford a relationship or a woman or protect a woman or provide for a woman, and then ultimately even their children. And so I think that plays out psychologically to the detriment of a lot of men. When in reality, I think those conditions have been slackened to a great deal, that women are looking for more emotional support, providing emotional security, psychological security. And you see that with a lot of women, for example, that have daddy issues, quite frankly, is that they're not really looking for daddy sugar per se. They're actually looking for somebody that they can be emotionally vulnerable with, somebody they can be emotionally protected by and supported by. And that's dramatically different than being Arnold Schwarzenegger in Barbarian. This hulking figure with a sword. And so I think that the definition there, I think there's a little bit of degree of flux. But ultimately, I think you need to, again, find out who you want to be and then seek out to be that individual and not necessarily compare yourself to cultural standards per se or other external influences, whether it's family or friends or even past historical role models. I talked, for example, at the last 21 convention about this notion of heroes and how we kind of start to identify with that and that we try to meet that expectations. I think with knowledge and awareness, we need to revisit some of that narrative that we create for ourselves and see whether or not that's applicable today. I think in many cases we've outgrown that ourselves, but we're not acknowledging it. And I think that plays out disastrously in a lot of men's lives.
Yeah, cool stuff. Jim, talk to me.
Yeah, we get ourselves into a lot of situations that we didn't really plan for.
No.
It just kind of comes on us one piece at a time. The next thing you know, you're under a mortgage and a wife and kids. But what you were saying earlier really resonated with me. We find ourselves in all these situations, and sometimes it's by choice, and we try things on. Right? We try this on, we try that on. And one of the points that I kind of felt like you made tangentially, but and check me on this, is that in the context of all these situations that we find ourselves in, whether we're under some financial debt or in a relationship or end up in some different part of the world, in that context, we have to find a way to somehow make peace and be happy in whatever that context is. Now,
and I think that's true of men and women. I think the difference between men and women is that culturally, and I know legally and politically, we will excuse accountability from women. We will just literally remove them of their decisions, the consequences of their decisions, and their responsibilities. So as being a female, I think they have a lot of benefits based on genetics alone. That with men, I think one of the base definitions is not necessarily just provide or protect, but accountability. If you are accountable to your situation, no matter how big of a failure it may have been personally or culturally or whatever it is, if you are starting to be accountable, I think the definition of a man is being fulfilled at that point. Not necessarily whether you're able to provide for others. And so I think for a lot of men that are recovering, that is crucially important to recognize and honor and respect that when they're actually being accountable for the situation they're in and then getting out of it. And that to me is one of the great hallmarks of any great man. It's not necessarily their successes, but what they persevered and strove through, that at the lowest point of their life, they were still remarkable individuals and men.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's not pretty.
No matter what.
Pretty, but...
Yeah, no matter what context or situation you find yourself in, you can make it yours.
Correct.
You can own this thing.
Yep.
Take responsibility. Just because you're a Buddhist doesn't mean you can't be a hot blonde.
Correct.
I know that from personal experience. But that's, we need to sit down and figure out who we are and what's best suited to us. And the vast majority of times, it's not where we're at. It's not where we're at. We may have glimpsed it at some point, or we may have been there at some point. But once we do figure out who we are and what we really want, it means big changes.
Yeah,
and it might be a long road before you get there.
Correct, and it's like there's kind of a saying that it goes back that self-reflection, and self-analysis is definitely worth doing, but is one of the most difficult things that'll ever take place, and it's a hallmark of a life well lived, is that periodically you take note of your life, where you're at, what you're doing, who you are, why you're doing those things, and that is a sign of a quality life. somebody who just has success heaped on them, again and again and again. I don't think that's necessarily a quality of life, as opposed to somebody who's developed character through a forging process of adversity and has gained tremendous insight to who they are. I think they have a higher degree of sense of self and awareness of self that people who have only known success and fairly easy life will never enjoy.
Well, around here, it's a very important part of the process for all of us, this self-discovery process. In fact, in the TSL online course, that is part of the first lesson from the beginning, and continues throughout the course. The self-discovery. Who are you? What do you really, 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 really want, without having to listen to the Spice Girls?
Right. Yep. And the interesting thing is, I think it's also evolutionary. That part may change, and I think to recognize those pivots is really important. For example, knowing your life trajectory, who I was when I was in my 20s and what I wanted to do and be is considerably different than when I'm 45. And so to naturally sit down and think that I'm going through a different phase of my life, I'm going to want and need different things, and consequently, I may have to look to and become different things or develop skill sets. But ultimately, ideally, you would want to think that you're the same person no matter whether your highs or lows or where you're at, that you have that same sense of self, self-awareness, and self-acceptance no matter where you're at, whether you're struggling or succeeding. You're still the same individual.
Yes, the self-acceptance is a big factor, because identity is a dynamic process, especially when you look at it over the longer term. What are your top 3 goals this year? A year from now could be very different. Something else steps up, or you discover that maybe what you thought was important turns out it wasn't.
And I think the element of looking long term is really beneficial from very statistical standpoint. Is that most people, when they do a year plan, vastly over compensate and basically have higher expectations of the goals that they'll be able to achieve in a 1-year time frame than what they do for 5. And what they find is that 5-year goals, they tend to vastly exceed those goals if they've been consistently applying them. And so I find that startling, that you sit down and say you're better off actually looking long-term rather than kind of a short 1-year time frame.
Really?
You look at any number of studies, is that they sit down and say the list of goals people will typically try to put on a 1-year plan, they won't be able to successfully fulfill. But those on a 5-year plan, if they're really constructed constructively, they tend to underestimate what they can achieve in 5 years, meaning that they vastly exceed their expectations. And so, but that's if you're constantly applying it, throughout those 5 years. So if you're hitting 80% of your 1-year goals, but they're all aligned to your 5-year goals, the odds are you're going to go beyond what you anticipated in your 5-year achievement plan.
Wow, that's very encouraging, because my class that I teach as a job, I stay after them about a 5-year plan. Have a 5-year plan, or a 10-year plan. If you're a young fellow, go with a 10-year plan. But my guys are going to be out of the workforce in 5 years, and so that's really encouraging. I had no idea that it was that.
Yeah, but I mean, again, you have to align it, and I've actually gone to the steps of actually, taking a Word document, and each page break is basically, a 5-year plan, a 2-year, 1 year, 9 months, 6 months, 3 months, and then I go down to 30 days and a week plan. And I make sure that the standard, there's some things you need to do and achieve in a week or a month that are not necessarily assigned to a 5-year plan, but that's just maintenance and maintaining your life. But I acknowledge those, but I make sure that those goals are all in alignment, that if I have something on a 5-year plan, I know what the benchmarks are throughout that process. And if I know I'm achieving those or working towards it, that is highly, highly beneficial, and I'm vastly more likely to hit those marks and then hit the 5-year and go beyond it. Something that I also will note that if you just have one of these sheets and every time you kind of do it, and I was doing it weekly when I was really active, it became nothing but a to-do list. It was incessant and unending. What I found to be just a tremendous asset was anything I accomplished, I started on that year's accomplished list, and I listed it out. So if there was something on the 1 month schedule, it got cut and it got put on my accomplishments. And instead of having a to-do list, what I started, and what I did was I reflected every time I looked at my list to do, I also looked at my accomplishments. And what you end up doing is not the to-do list, but you wanted to feed the accomplishments. And that is a completely different mindset from having a to-do list. Is to say, I want to accomplish this, as opposed to, oh God, you have to do this. And so that was a change in mindset.
Drawn versus driven. Are you drawn down the road, or are you driven down the road? And
that is something that I experienced from having failed at doing that. That was sitting there going, this should be a beneficial thing. And it got to the point that I wouldn't look at it. I hated looking at it. It was constantly there, to the point that I was going to delete it because I just knew it existed. And I thought, you need to change that. And if I wasn't self-aware of saying what's driving this behavior, what's the cause of it, it's not the list, what's causing this. And the fact is, I wasn't getting any validation out of it. I wasn't getting any sense of accomplishment. And of course, every time you do an accomplishment, there are all these hormonal releases. We talked about pair bonding and everything else, a sense of achievement and fulfillment. But it also goes to a sense of self, energy, your immune system. All those things are linked. That the more oxytocin you have in your system, the healthier your immune state is. And so, when I was stressing myself out, I was lowering my immune state. I wasn't feeling good. I was, just ill and more susceptible to colds and viruses, and obviously my inflammation and diet things. And so there was a lot driving those sort of things.
Well, I can see the great value in an accomplished list, but I have the problem, I think many of us do, in that we set out goals and it turns into a to-do list.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to stop that. I don't know how to stop that, because I set out a goal and then I start breaking it down into little pieces.
Yep.
And I can't let it be simple, easy, and basic, to use the current term around here.
Well, and I think the difference is, on a to-do list, there's no why. You're not attached to why am I doing this. And if you know your reason for doing things, I think that provides a tremendous more opportunity for providing your self-excellence, increasing your morale, is that if you sit down and link these goals to a real reason, not sit down like, say, I want a car, I want to pay off my house, but a reason why, and to have that done, it becomes a really much more positive element than a simple to-do list, which it is by definition.
I see how that could work. I'm going to try
that. For example, paying your monthly bills, that's a pain in the ass, especially for a guy who doesn't have a lot of money, who's rebounding, and hitting hard times, and just, it's so much easier not, and to just sort of throw yourself at exploitive entertainment issues, and to sit down and say, look, am I being a man by being an example to my children, by not paying my bills? And every time I pay my bills, I'm showing by an example what it means to be a man. Whether my children acknowledge that, I will know it. And so when I pay my monthly bills, because those are my obligations, I agree to them, I ask for them, and they are mine. When I pay my bills, I'm fulfilling my obligations as a man. That is completely different than saying, pay your fucking electric bill. To sit down and say, when I write my bills, I'm fulfilling my obligations as a man of the things that I chose for myself.
Well, and I can see how it creates more possibilities than just a to-do list.
Correct.
When you hold a goal, you know the purpose, then it creates a lot of possibilities, a lot more than just the mundane things that you have on the to-do list that give you the opportunity to progress in that direction.
Well, this is one thing that is kind of funny. We're talking about a lot of stuff which is very good, but man, Jim, you didn't like our last mastermind call where we're going through what is the mastermind program, what's the philosophy. But part of that, see, it's doing that same exercise, where, like, because I'm listening to this whole thing going like, man, all right, new definitions of accountability, how to be responsible, how to, be a man of your word, all that sort of stuff, and just be a human being that has integrity. Well, you got to be responsible for what it is you got in front of you, and you have to know the why, which in TSL we have we define as the purpose. That is our
Correct.
why of it. And the thing is that I think when you're going over the bill thing, I'm just like, man, it would still suck to pay bills. It would still like, okay, well, I'm doing this because it's for my kids. I'm doing this because it's for, my health. I'm doing this for whatever. But I think first for me, it's so important to know the meaning and the identity. And again, a big thing in TSL, as Jim said, is we explore our identities a lot. I mean, it's almost like it goes again and again and again, where it's like, what does it mean? Do I want to be a man? Am I making a healthy choice
Right.
or a choice about my health because society says so, or because like I really want to change? I mean, and I think for me, this is what I love about the 21 convention. This is what's so cool about, what Anthony did is he brought all these people together. I learned about health. I mean, man, I was very, very unhealthy. I mean, to the point of where I did not work out from 15 to 30 and maybe even more than that. The first time I ran a mile again in 16 years was when I was 31. And, I worked out like crazy. And when I don't know what health and fitness is, I go to who looks healthy or who has the best advertisement. But it wasn't
Right.
until I started hanging out with some of the speakers that Anthony had turned me on to, and listened to what they said specifically, was that I actually got an inkling of what health was. This last
Right.
year, at the end of 2013, I felt really unhealthy, and I'm still, kind of figuring out whatever the hell all that is. And for being healthy for me now, it's like, of course, there's the image. Of course, there's like, oh, well, you're carrying around some fat. You're not, you can't compete against other people or whatever, all that shit. But man, bottom line is no, man, I want to be alive because I know what
Right.
it means to be alive. And if we went into our decisions about relationships, who we talk to, how we spend our time, how we interact with people with some pride in ourselves and who we are, men and women, man, we'd have a much, I think, better unity, much better, interacting with each other. Everything I think would work a little bit better. But the problem is we get caught up in this blame game, and it's something that it's not. We talk about it in our groups quite a bit, but it's not really in the stuff that we've written with a lot of the TSL stuff. We talk about antisocial behavior, being blame, being resentment, being basically holding on to things. And if we hold
Hmm.
on to those things like confusion, frustration, resentment, blaming people, we'll start to move into behavior, which will be dependent upon what other people think. Superficiality will be more important than what's within you. Ideas of enforcement of equality will be more important than your own personal definition of it. Yada, 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 yada. You get the idea. But the thing is that, man, if I took that sense of pride, because at first when I hear you say, well, when I'm paying my bills, when I'm making this list, and what's even more funny is I just talked to my friend Kevin texted me and he said he had told me to make a 5-year list 5.5 years ago. And I said, man, I wish I would have made that list because I, accomplished a lot of the things that we had talked about, when I was at that change in my life. And he's like, well, you could make a 10-year list.
Yeah. Yeah.
but,
Right.
but you're right in that sense that I'm not bogged down by the particulars. I'm not bogged down by being confined in a box. Oftentimes when I make a list for myself, like a checklist, it's around what I should do,
Right.
not what
Yep.
is an expression of me. But if I make a 5-year list, there's all sorts of room for augmentation within that on how to achieve that goal. So it's kind of an
Correct. Yep.
interesting.
Yep.
That was
Absolutely.
my instinct on it when you first said it, and then you said a
Well,
bunch
and I
of other
think you
crazy good shit too.
to capitalize on something you said about the element of living, and I think the elements that I talked about with my house in particular and the obligations I faced was the fact that the definition of how I wanted to live and my sense of living was no longer conducive to the situation in which I created, and that built a tremendous amount of resentment. So what I had to do was face reality of saying, okay, you've got this obligation, you're going to meet it. But how do you sit down and achieve the sense of living while under this circumstance of being just incredibly debt poor as far as being, the debt of the degree of indebtedness in which I have for the house, and the lack of capital that I have to be able to spend. What are the things I can do? And when I started to look for those and put those things came up on my list, whether it was having, a meal with friends at the house or having a get together, for a wind down or whatever it was, and mine tended to be social in nature. Then all of a sudden I felt like I was living irrespective of the amount of debt I was, in. And so that became a different element for me, is to focus in on those things that made me feel alive, and what were those things by definition? And then how do I incorporate that into the things that I'm doing or wanting to achieve? And if you're striving towards things that are making you feel alive, I think it's almost impossible not to feel good about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So your worth stopped being just debt, bank account stuff, and actually came through towards like how were you socializing, how were you living. And actually, I remember that, man. You used to invite everybody over to your place after the convention, to sit
Yeah,
and talk
absolutely.
and hang
Yep.
out. And I imagine at other times too.
Well, and that was a remarkable element, that here I designed and built this house around a relationship that utterly destructive. And I was actually able to, because of that failure, find the people that I invited there to that house. And that was a remarkable time for me, because everybody that was in that house that evening was a direct result of my personal failures. And it is through my failures that I found achievement. And in situations in which, for example, having this conversation right now would never have happened had I not gone through that personal failure, and taken ownership and taken a direct action in changing my life for the better. And because of that, it opened up a whole nother possibilities that was never on my list or even sense on awareness.
Man, something that I almost don't trust anybody who hasn't had a sense of failures or they're unwilling to show it. And I know that most of the time it's because people are afraid and all that sort of stuff. And, I think one of the big
Well, I think it's
flaws.
strictly that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just our relationship with having to show up up front is so tough. But man, you got to realize your failures are a gift every time. And man, I've had some like shit which was not cool, but every time it happens, it's happened so much in my life that at this point, man, knock on wood, but I have faith that this will help me because
Yep.
it is, I mean, man, hurtful, very sad, fucked up things. And, right now in my life, and one of the things that I'm so proud of for myself personally and my big mission with uh, anything that I do, not even just TSL, is that, people also can, work through this stuff too, is that a lot of times when I feel emotions now, I just feel them. Well, at least in comparison to before. Man, there
Mhm.
was some shit that hit me hard about 2 years ago, and man, I just remember I just started crying. I couldn't help it. It was just such a devastating and sad fucking moment. And and it sucked. And the best part about that was it just hurt. It just hurt and it was
Right.
sad. Whereas before, my emotions were attached to so many things. And I'm talking like I'm past it or whatever, or am somehow on the certain. There's definitely things in my life that fuck me up and give me plenty of anxiety and you know get into like levels of self worth and get stuck in areas where I get trapped in my own head and not letting
Right. Yeah.
myself get rid of the blockage. But man, what a awesome thing that has come together, and basically how you've said, man, how you Sock have said, come together through the internet of people coming together who, man, we're all kind of crazy. As I like to saying, we're all crazy, but not on the same day. So,
And
that's
that's true. And the other part is everybody who showed up that night had gone through similar personal failures, and that's
hmm
what drew us together. We were seeking resolutions, we were seeking ways of being. Now, I don't, just to clarify, I don't think making mistakes just in the sense of making mistakes is beneficial, but making failures in the pursuit of excellence or achievement or ambition to strive to better yourself. I think those are always beneficial, one way or another.
Yeah,
they may
yeah.
not be at the moment, but there are fucks ups that are just fuck ups, and that's it. But they're not striving to better themselves. And ultimately it's a race within yourself, not as a comparison. It's like I think I spoke once about being a noble being, about you're trying to be better than you were today, or yesterday. And if you can sit down and say that, I think you've accomplished a great deal.
Well, there's not as a comparison. I'm running into this thing where I still have pangs about women that I loved, women that I love.
Mm-hmm.
20 years later. I
Yeah.
mean, many years later, and the pangs are always, why couldn't I have been the man I am now then? Yeah, because it would have been
There's the
so good. They were
resistance.
wonderful. They were gorgeous, and I was apparently good enough to get them in my life. But
Right.
why in the world couldn't I have been the man I am now?
Jim, let me tell you, man, you need to bring this up on Monday's podcast with Nate, because this is all we talked about. Yeah, man, it's maybe you shouldn't.
It makes me recognize the fact that I love these women.
Right.
It's not past tense. It's now. I love them now.
Mm-hmm.
And that part doesn't change.
No, and I think that's terribly natural, and I think it would be terribly unhealthy if it did. You can always see a sociopath because they don't have those feelings. It's one of the surefire indications of a sociopath is they don't have those reminiscent feelings about people in the past, that they can completely disenfranchise themselves from their emotions with their past history.
Well, I'm pretty good at that, really. In general, I'm pretty good at that.
Now, is that by nature, or is that something you did as a defense mechanism?
It's by nature. Okay. My family is stoic for generations. For generations.
Now, do you think that's a genetic line or a family cultural history that you've embraced?
I think it may well be both. It may well be both. It's certainly a family line that I've embraced, but I'm evolving past it.
Mm-hmm.
I have an experience and express emotions like I never did before. I'm still a little bit dysfunctional in that I don't always recognize just what they are. Can't really put the name on it, but I experience these things fully. And probably without intending for it to be, the fact that I've loved these women gives me a driver, in that it a generalized love of women and the ability to be really interested and curious about who she is, her femininity. Yeah, it's not just about getting laid, although
right.
I'm very, very much sexually driven. But it gives me this abiding love for women. I mean, the ones that have gone before paid the ticket for the ride.
Right. Yeah, and that's I kind of talk about. It's kind of an ugly thing I'll do to my exes. I'll when I see them again, I'm like, my current girlfriend just thanks you.
Oh, you're nasty. Oh, that is nasty.
It's horrible, but and that's a failure on my part. Low self-esteem, self-respect.
Oh no,
but I have to be vicious to point you. So, and it's also okay to acknowledge that I'm human. I have these impulses, and God, there's a reward for acting on them sometimes.
I've been really tempted to do it the other way, to tell my current girlfriends how grateful they should be to all the other women who have been in my life.
And that's very truthful. I joke that for example, my sexual history and past. I went out to create an interesting life, and I was very, very, very intentional. It was in many cases I did things that would put me in direct opportunities of things that I would never, have done on my own or couldn't anticipate, knowing that there would be stories involved or created. And that rich storytelling, unfortunately, it deals a lot of intimacies with other women that kind of, hurts the woman I'm seeing, or she develops insecurities. And I'm like, you know what? All of those stories have led me to you, and all I can sit down and say is I've, skidded right up to you and go, my God, do I have a story to tell you? Where have you been? And my God, do I have a story to tell you? And it's very sincere. And
well,
that changes the dynamics.
It creates an interesting question. We all have baggage,
mm-hmm.
and especially those of us who are over 30, over 40. By the time we're over 40 and moving into these relationships, everybody has baggage. How do you carry it lightly? How do you carry it gracefully? And how do we identify the women who are able to carry it gracefully? Because we've all run into this. It's like stepping on a fucking landmine that you
mm-hmm.
never knew was there, but for some reason you set
Yep.
something off.
The reality is I don't necessarily tell everybody everything immediately. So if I'm carrying baggage, to a degree, it may come up. I'll say that these are sensitive issues, and I'll explain why, or whatever it is, and to explain some of those things. But the other part, as far as carrying your own baggage, I think in a lot of cases, sometimes we are carrying baggage that's not rightfully ours. I think that people will assign baggage, and because of we are men, we're also taught to be stoic, to carry the load, to shoulder the burden. And I think in a lot of cases, a lot of our failed relationships weren't necessarily driven solely by us. Even when, for example, I'll use the point where I was horribly cheating on this one gal for between her and another girl for 2.5 years. I mean, it was back and forth simultaneously. I in hindsight, I can't tell you the honest story because I don't know it anymore. It was just a blur. And I lost out on 2 amazing women that I can honestly look back and, like you, sit down and go, God, if I was only the man I was today. But the reality was, at that point in time, I wasn't. And at that point in time, I was doing the best I could. Or you sit down and acknowledge the areas that you weren't. But I would also sit down and say, in both their instances, they were playing on vulnerabilities that I was not secure, that my emotional needs were not being met.
You were not in this alone. You were not in this by yourself.
That is correct. And so I cannot, in all honesty, take on that burden of a failed relationship solely by myself.
Okay, that lightens the load. But once we've lightened the load, how do you carry the remainder?
It depends on how bad is it bothering you. If it's something that is cancerous and it's eating at you, I think you have to address it. I think you have to look, at ways in which what would be the least you could do to resolve this issue. It may be verbally acknowledging it out loud by yourself. It may be making an admission of accountability to the individual. It may be doing other things. It may be, for example, I'll sit down and say a large driver of the blog that I'm writing is to acknowledge the hurt and the pain and the suffering that I caused on others because I didn't have the skill sets involved for those relationships. And so today I'm doing things to make sure I'm a better person, having been accountable for those things, and I'm not replicating it. And
that adds,
there are some
that adds a whole new dimension to the idea of pay it forward.
Correct. And the last element is that, for example, the 12-step program with AA, the most important part that they'll mention is the last step. And they can sit down and say with almost certainty that if you don't embrace the last step, okay, you're going to be recidivism, you're going to fall back in, and you're still an alcoholic. The moment that you can actually accomplish the last step is the moment that you're free and clear of it. And that is helping others. The 12th step is helping others.
Steve has something to say about that, I'm sure.
Well, rather not. But
hey,
no, I think
if I'm throwing stones in a glass house, I don't intend to. But what I do find is that there's something terribly, terribly powerful about owning a mistake and finding somebody that's facing that or in a similar situation and helping them through that. I think that is making whole with life, with yourself, and, you know, let's say karma in general. But I think there's something psychologically moving to that you can then bury it and lay it to rest. The other is to, you know, in a very ceremonious way, acknowledge when you're letting it go. You know, women will burn photographs and stuff like that of ex-boyfriends and stuff. But I think there's a element of acknowledgement when you formally let something go, and to face the ghosts of your past, because you just don't want to be haunted by them. And you know, to talk about this idea of trying to circumvent pain or to get around it, I don't think we really can. I think if we circumvent pain, it's still there. The core of it, whatever's left unaddressed, will grow.
agree.
And I think we need to acknowledge it and address it.
I think the real issue for guys, well, hold on one second. I know somebody wants to pop in here. I think it's Michael. But
Steve.
what's happening, dude? I know you're gonna say something good. I'm just gonna, Michael, I'll let you talk. I was gonna say something, but go for it. No, go for it. I know it's gonna be good because I know you.
Well, man, Jim, I just wanted to say thank you for some of the stuff that you said, because I liked it. And Steve, I just want to say congratulations on having a life that's coming, you know.
Yeah. You're welcome, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah. You know, that it's a good stuff. But one of the things that it has made a big difference to me, especially about those pangs from the past, is and I don't know if this is healthy, or a good idea for anyone else or anything, but what I like to do is acknowledge that there's a part of me that isn't bounded by time. There's a part of me when I was young. There was a young me, that did stuff that seemed like it was a good idea at the time, and there was a middle-aged me that did stuff that seemed to be a good idea at the time, and I fucked up things that I wouldn't have fucked up if I had been me later. But there's a part of me that feels all the way back to the very first crush I had, when I was, I didn't even I didn't even know what sex was, and the little girl at the babysitter's with me, kind of got into that situation where her parents got a job in another town and they left, and she went away. And even though that was a situation that I didn't screw up because I didn't have the skills at the time, I still feel the pangs in my heart for her, this little 5-year-old girl, just like I was a 5-year-old boy, and when I get up in the morning, it's not always on my mind, but when it hits me, or when I feel it, I have to do something to give in some way, to express in some way, and sometimes it's just me on the back stairs with a cigarette, burning, saying Danielle, if you're anywhere, I just want you to know that I remember you, and I'll never forget you,
And I'm a military brat myself, so having that scenario play out, I've experienced.
Yeah.
And as an adult, I can rationalize that we're biologically hardwired for those experiences. That's one of the reasons, just like sex, we're driven together. we're also hardwired hormonally to create immense memories for this, to drive us towards each other, so the species would survive and all these biological things. But that doesn't help me on a psychological level, understanding the mechanics of that. But one of the things I'll do, and I've done this with past relationships and people that are actually dead, is I'll speak to the dead. There's nothing wrong with doing exactly what you're doing, sitting down, acknowledging it, and having a conversation with that little girl as the 5-year-old boy, as the individual you are now, and embracing that and sitting down and feeling those emotions. I think men shirk the responsibility of actually feeling those emotions, and they try to sit down and we try to control them so it doesn't play out. But I think in many ways you can't not feel those and not be healthy. And if there's a mourning process, I think you need to go through it. If there's a kind of a sense of loss, I think you need to experience that. And when we don't, I think they still resonate. And from time to time, for example, I'll have memories and they'll come up and they'll be acute. And you'll be like, you know what? As painful as it is, I am so thankful that I can still feel that. And that I acknowledge that I can feel these things, that they're real, and I'm alive for it. So I would get very comfortable doing just that.
One thing that
acknowledging it. Oops, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, there's a slight delay, so I don't mean to be walking over any of you guys. But man, before Michael spoke, I was basically going to say, man, what's so important about all this is that we need to, as men, or as people, because I don't want it to just be about men. If it divides, you need to recognize what's different and the specifics and all that sort of stuff. But I think if it overall divides and doesn't create unity, it's not something I really stand for. It's not something I stand for. But is a group, it's so important to be able to go through these different processes, because especially something like the grieving process, whether it's this could even go into, what Jim was saying about ex-lovers and whatnot, people that you still love but are out of your life, whether they've passed or they, you just don't talk to them anymore. I think that there's no rule other than it's got to follow its course. I mean, it just goes in so many different ways. And man, what I'm hearing from this is, Sock, you have your own ways of discovering, different ways to get over life experiences. And man, guys need that. Women need it too, but because we're a bunch of guys on this call right now, I mean, man, men need that and some direction. And, one thing that is so difficult is as soon as we have rules, they get enforced and everything gets fucked up. And that's really why we really try and keep things about principles and suggestions and all that sort of stuff. Because, man, everybody's going to do it different. Your way of getting over your stuff is going to be different than me and everybody else in these different groups. But if we can come on and unify towards being a better person, being somebody that, could be really the best expression of ourselves. Like, I really feel that I don't care about, being top of society, or I don't even want that to be a standard in the whole TSL kind of regimen, just because I think that causes division. But to be the best expression of myself, to know what that means, learn. And man, this is what I really like about what you're bringing to the table is learn what integrity means, learn what responsibility means, learn what your image of who you are means, and stand for that. Man, that is something that I think we can all find benefit from. And, since we're already dialoguing here, guys, if you have something that you want to say or mention or whatever, just type it into the chat box. If you're on the phone, you don't have a chat box, so you'll have to speak up, wait for a break. But we'll let you talk if you voice yourself. And type it into the chat box, or unmute yourself and talk, whatever it is. But let's make this into a dialogue, because the worst thing in the world can be is that if everybody thinks TSL is me, because clearly if you're a part of this, man, if you're a part of this program, it's not, man. It's fucking.
Well, and that's the worst thing about writing is you do it alone, and it's a solitary. Typically it's a solitary pursuit. And so when I write, I don't get to hear this.
Keep
Did I
talking.
lose you
Keep
guys? I
talking.
got a little bit of
No,
feedback on that.
there was an
No.
echo. Sorry about that.
Okay. Okay. Now, if it's echo, I can talk over my own echo. That'll be fine. A little discombobulating, but that'll be all right. But what I found with writing is that you don't have the connection with real live, breathing, feeling human beings, and it's really hard to write in, basically an echo chamber of your own head, and kind of project what could be out there. And so what you end up doing is a lot of self-projection. So what you're going to see in my writings are really me talking to myself, and they're underscoring a lot of the personal failures that I've seen, and can sit down and say, God, I wish I would have known that, or even my own self-development. Having, I spend a tremendous amount of time researching the stuff that I write about. It takes about 10 to 15 hours of just research and writing and doing that stuff before I even start to write the blog post, as short as they are. But, to sit down and have somebody else talk, ask questions, that's a privilege I don't get to see or experience often. So I'd love to hear from the guys.
Yeah, and I think that's
I got
really.
a question for you.
Oh, go ahead, Rick.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the talk about girlfriends. There's talk about different things, right? And all these. But man, so often I know, like myself, and I know other guys here will run into resistance. Like it's like, man, I'm getting pleasure out of eating this pizza, so why make the change? And you're just resistant to it, Or somebody's like, man, why go up and talk to the girl, because man, I'm probably gonna get blown out or whatever, so I'm just not gonna do it. There's all these different expressions of resistance, right?
Right.
And how does SOC deal with resistance? How do you think, in like just the most simplest way, how would you deal with resistance, or think people should deal with resistance?
I would sit down and say that there's always associated fear of it. And what I found to be really beneficial in my life is to call things for what they are. So for example, if I'm craving a lot of carbohydrates or breads, and I'm supposed to be on an anti-inflammatory diet, and I know that my body produces or will metabolize that as sugar, I need to call that loaf of bread, 3 tablespoons of sugar. And if I don't, I'm kind of making up political correct terms to make it acceptable to have it, or to make it acceptable to resist the things I know I need to do to develop, certain things. Like, for example, if I know I'm trying to be more social and I need to learn to open girls or whatever it is, and I'm all of a sudden afraid of doing it or resist, really sit in and go, God, I don't want to do this one. I sit down and will say, all right, let's talk about it. Don't force yourself to do it. What am I resisting and turning into it? And then call it out by name. In many cases I'm resisting something because it's not in my sense of reality. And if it's a particular girl, I have to sit down and say, why? What is it that she's exuding or I'm projecting that tells me that she's not in my sense of reality? And is that true? And I'm not saying that, anybody is in your sense of reality. I think there are very many instances where we know. What is it? Am I not congruent with who I would project or who I anticipate her to want or like or be sexually attracted to? Sometimes these things are mythological. They're only in our head. And to acknowledge it and call it by name and address it at a base level, I found to be beneficial to overcome a lot of the resistance. Other things are saying, if I know I need to work out and I'm resisting going, why am I resisting? What is it? Is my body telling me something that you're overtraining, or you're not having enough sleep, or you're overstressed? That's more detrimental than not working out. I need to acknowledge and find the root causes of that. Let's go ahead.
Yeah, so Socrates, right? I totally follow you, but like, man, I think every one of us here, when we're in our blind spot, can really be good at justifying it. It seems like it might be almost impossible to do by ourselves. Do you think that may be true? And the second thing is that if we do need others, how can we, as others who are trying to support people, help people with that? I hear call it out, but man, sometimes I've called out things that people are like, no, you just don't understand. They say they want to change, but at the same time, I kind of say, well, I guess you don't want to change. And I kind of dropped it. But I'm wondering what you...
I think that they're not wanting to change because the reward for not changing is more beneficial immediately than the rewards for the potential for change. For example, a lot of guys will stay in a relationship way longer, and I know, and this I'm speaking specifically from personal history, way longer than I should, and not willing to cut a relationship short when you don't necessarily know everything, but you know it's not working quite out or it's not what you really want, and waiting for a true failure point. And because the threat of being alone, isolated, invalidated from the relationships, whatever benefits you have, the familiarity pattern, the chemical responses you get from being around that, outweigh the risk of being alone. And so consequently, I think we will cling to these sort of unhealthy relationships, or relationships that should probably finish a lot earlier, because we don't have, and there's a number of ways they coin it, abundancy mentality, or a willingness to go it alone, to face that kind of fear, or to face that measure of she's going to find someone well sooner than I will, and the invalidation that comes with that. And I think there's a tremendous value of looking into those insights and to the drivers that drive our behavior. I think in many cases, for example, I'm an introvert by nature. I will enjoy sitting down and watching people as opposed to go open a number of women that I may want to talk to. And I at times will sit down and intentionally know I could, I should, but I'm deciding not to. And if I'm deciding not to, that's completely different than resisting something else. It's a conscious decision. When it's a conscious decision, I own it. I'm no longer ruled by it. And if I want to change that reality, I have to do something about it. Knowledge and awareness won't change anything. You have to put conscious action behind something to make it real.
Cool, Socrates. That last example, that might be a good one, because I know a lot of guys in the group might find it helpful, right? Hey, they want to meet people, they want to talk to people, but they're constantly choosing to say, well, I just want to sit here and watch. I just want to sit here. But at the same time, they have that complaint, right, that they're not meeting it. And so there's a justification, and they're like, hey, Socrates said if I just acknowledge and say, I just want to sit here, well, then they don't make the change. There's really an underlying of resistance. People can be really good at justifying stuff.
And I'm no different. I'm no different whatsoever. But I also own it, that if I'm not willing to act on the things that I know and do the efforts to get good at what I need to do to get what I want, no one's held accountable but myself.
Very true. A mentor a long time ago used to tell me, he said, man, he goes, if you're in a pile of shit, just at least admit you're in a pile of shit, because one day at least you'll realize that you are, and you'll know the way to get out of it.
Correct, yeah.
Admit to yourself you're stuck in a pile of shit and keep pretending it's a bed of roses. You'll where am I? Why am I stuck? I don't get it. So totally get the idea of being open and honest about where, at least if you're choosing to be stuck, admit to choose to be stuck, if I got you correctly.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's not just being stuck. It's where you're at. If you sit down and say, this is where I'm at, and this is a snapshot, let's say highs and lows of your life, it's just where you're at. That's where you're at. If you're saying this is where I'm at and I can't do any better, because I'm not willing to put the time in, well, that's not the circumstance anymore. That's you. And that, again, is, taking ownership for the things that you truly own. If in persistence you sit down and say, I really want to get that particular girl, okay, and just going across and saying hi, I know is not going to be good enough, and I'm going to flounder, and my self-esteem is going to take a hit. I would honestly sit down and say you're better off doing the baby steps, and I don't necessarily mean baby steps to be derogatory, but the small, consistent steps over time to build that self-esteem, self-awareness, self-respect, and to actually be the interesting guy that you are and could be, okay, that's going to be attractive by her, okay, that she's going to be attractive and be the type of guy she's going to be attracted by. And that's completely different than forcing a guy into a set and say, you just need to open. I've seen that to be catastrophic for guys that get blown out or crushed or their self-esteem isn't met because they had unrealistic expectations of what would occur. Now, it may be as simple as saying, hey, force yourself, just go over, say hi, and get the hell out. Do nothing more than say hi and walk away. Hey, how you doing? Walk off. If you can do that, and that's all you need to achieve, go do it. A lot of times I think behind a lot of these things we resist isn't the initial thing that we're trying to achieve. It's a lot of back-loaded elements behind it. It's going over, saying hi, wowing the chick, sweeping her off her feet, having sex with her, and having this amazing relationship. And that's completely different than having a guy just go over and say hi.
I totally got it. Yeah, and I always wonder about that deeper stuff. Like me personally, right? And I know this is being recorded, but like, man, I've had multiple hip surgeries, and I realized the man that I was, or that I want to be, right? And yet, I've been in and out of physical therapy multiple times, and so I'm like so hung on to that past that it really makes me resist the future of who I am right now.
Correct. Yep.
Get that right now and own that, but doesn't change anything.
Right.
So that's another thing then, because as you're talking, I'm thinking, how can I play it directly to me? I know I've been asking you to do the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. So live up to the same thing. So that's where I'm at, and I've admitted that to the guys here that I've talked to, that but how do I create change if I really want to? Because man, it's just a lot easier just to hold on to the saying, hey, this is who I am.
Right. And there are some just straight up realities of life. Like the fitness guys that Steve was talking about will sit down and tell you, you have to have a particular physique and genetic code to be a world-class weightlifter, to compete at those levels. But that does not mean that you can't take the same degree of intensity, training, smarts, and become the vastly better individual physically that you could have become. And again, the notion on that is not to be comparing yourself to other projections or other standards, but to your potential. What's your potential, and are you achieving it?
Cool. In comparison, it's a huge thing.
Oh God, it's terrible to do. It's one to use it as a guidepost, but to really measure yourself by any other standards than yourself is really detrimental, especially when you're the one not setting the standards.
Yeah, because I find myself, when I compare myself, I could either make myself a king or a pauper. It's just like,
right.
Oh, great! Look at me compared to all these. And it's funny, like I teach like this martial art thing, right? And one of my students was talking about, and he felt all this pressure. He's like, "You don't get it. Everybody gets a doctorate these days." And I'm like,
yeah, that's true.
Well, I go, so who's everybody? And took the ambiguity, right? Because people get stuck in it. It turned out to be like 3 people that he knew their doctorate, and he was competing with those 3 people. And once he called real straight way, like you're talking about, he was like, "Oh, dude, I guess I'm just competing with these 3 people. Everybody does it." And then it became about he wanted to compete with those people, or that he wanted his doctorate, But
Yep.
I'm like, cool. Compete with
and the same thing is true of hero worship. If you have a number of childhood heroes, personal heroes you develop in life, or whatever it is, what we do is we don't sit down and say these people are inspirations. They transcend inspirations, and they become a mile marker that we measure our own lives to. In many instances that we don't realize that there was a very human element to these individuals. We also have a tendency to make a composite of all these hero ideas and all these standards, and expect us to be measured across the entire spectrum of it. And that is terribly unfair to ourselves. And the last part of all that is the notion that the voice inside your head is actually you. And there's kind of this element of Zen philosophy that Eckhart Tolle had kind of come up with, and I'm giving credit to him because it's not mine. But that, your brain is an organism, and unfortunately it has the capacity for voice, your thoughts inside your head. But like any organism, self-preservation is its major function. And the reality is that your brain will say and do things because it has its own agenda. Self-esteem, self-protection, you're not good enough, you're not handsome enough, you can't do this, or whatever it is. And it's there to protect the body, yourself. But the issue is that's not you. You're the conscious awareness behind that voice. That's completely different than saying, I'm this individual having all these horrible self-thoughts or self-projection thoughts or thoughts of hate. That's my mind going off, okay? And that's an organ. And like organs, it should be under my control. And I think the first part is to recognize it and call it out for what it is. So when I have all these horrible, crazy thoughts, or ideas of, lack of self-worth, I sit down and go, is that honestly me talking, or is that my mind? And there's a difference. And sometimes that takes off a tremendous amount of pressure and anxiety. And anxiety is always associated with future performance. Depression is always past performance. So if I'm suffering anxiety, I know it's about future projection.
So let me chime in here, because we've talked about a lot of stuff. What is it that you want to move in talking about? Like, what is the, with I guess the next 21 convention is going to be in Tampa. Pretty crazy.
Yeah, see, I haven't gotten the news. So that's the first news for me. So that's fantastic.
Oh, I had only heard it from from Zuzu, but I don't. I'll see Anthony in a week.
Okay. Yeah, you will.
But it's so hard to keep up, because I have my own stuff going on. You have your own stuff going on, that I don't always check in what is happening with him. But yeah, what's the next thing on the horizon for you? Like, what's the big thing that you feel, the message you want to put out there, and evolve and kind of workshop with guys and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm about 25 posts right now that I've gotten already listed out that I know I want to make. And
oh my God, you are a checklist nut. Are you serious?
Oh, no. You don't. I'm dead serious, and I've already completed 53. Now, originally it was only 12. Okay, so it's expanded as I started doing my own research and said, no, this really needs its own subject, and so I parse it out. So, for example, when I talk about relationship skills, I will sit down and have written, let's say, 12 different blog posts on specific skills, whether it's boundary setting, communication skills, active listening, those are skills. I also talk about basically maintenance, okay, or actually I skip one. I also then talk about management. I also talk about the management skills you need to do within a relationship, and that's apart from the actual relationship skills. How you manage a relationship is its own subject area, so it's like a complete chapter. Within a chapter, I think I have another 12 posts just on management issues associated with relationships. I'm currently in the middle, or at the I can't say honestly middle. I'm at the beginning, relatively, first quarter of relationship maintenance, and dealing with all the things you need to do to be able to maintain a relationship. Because I don't think most men know. Most men aren't having had life experiences in corporations or organizations where maintenance was a very critical element to success. I happen to be very lucky and was exposed to 2 organizations that had maintenance and training as critical components to their overall mission objectives as far as their organizations were concerned. So that I'm writing those now, and then ultimately I'll need to be talking about post elements. How to handle a breakup, I think, is an enormous subject that would be several posts long. How to recover from one. How to also end a relationship. I know I talked briefly at one of the conventions about ending a relationship appropriately, what to recognize the signs, how to do it appropriately, and so forth. And then ultimately, what are the gears up for marriage, and what are the things you're going to need to be looking for? And this one becomes really politically active for me, and it's been kind of a number of issues. There's some political and financial elements. There's contract law to consider. Right now, marriages are all under family law. And while we can talk about prenuptial agreements, it's very limiting, and it doesn't deal anything with child custody or arrangements with dealing with custody. And I think there's an area within law that we can take marriage relationships out of family law and put them in civil law, where you're actually treated equally. And that would be terribly telling. So I think could be a lot of stuff on that, and stuff that I quite honestly, I have not read or heard from anybody. It's just basically going through, looking at this stuff, talking to a number of lawyer friends of mine that deal with either divorce or child custody issues, and kind of, seeking that sort of stuff out, to sit down and say, how do we protect ourselves if we're going to go into this institution called marriage? And that the only part that's valid, economically and contractually, are the economic sides. How do you protect yourself? How do you, and not necessarily say protective in a defensive nature, but how do you put the incentives back into marriage when they've been removed culturally, politically, and legally? And that's a terribly profound element. And so I think in all, I'm working towards those sort of elements. And if I'm lucky enough to write one blog post every 2 weeks, I've got enough work for a year. And right now, I have not written a blog post in 2 months because of work and my illness.
Yeah,
It's
no, I
going to be
hear
a lot.
that.
If I'm asked to talk again, I have no idea what I'm going to talk about. So I'm
So,
always kind of surprised at the conversations.
so let's go over this. Like, well, I got two questions. I'll start with
Hmm.
one that's a little bit more negative, but how does one handle a breakup? I mean, this
Oh,
is like, so here's something so you hear all the time, like how you're supposed to act, all that sort of shit. Man, you're in love, you've experienced life together, and it's
yep,
just not working.
yep.
Man, people don't have direction on that shit, and they fuck
They
I
don't.
have. I mean, Jesus.
And something I've talked about and I experienced firsthand is that people that don't know how to break up appropriately will break up inappropriately. And they will do the most egregious, harmful, deceitful, and ugly things. Things that they will be ashamed of, things that they will later be humiliated by, things that they'll be haunted by. Now, that doesn't help you out at all. Unfortunately, you'll do the same thing. If you do not know how to get out of a relationship honestly with integrity, to place accountability where it's truly due. For example, with the two girls that I was seeing simultaneously over 2 years, 2.5 years, to sit down and say, look, these are my emotional and physical and sexual needs. They're not being met in this relationship, or I can't be under this misnomer of a committed relationship in this place in my life right now, and not willing to own up to it appropriately. I will step out because my base biological needs will trump social convention, and that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We will protect and defend ourselves at base biological needs level far more than we will on a civil level, and so based on that, I will act out. I will have affairs. I will get caught. I will be the jerk that will end up ending the relationship in a way in which I wouldn't have done, appropriately. So recognizing that, and then to sit down and say you're strong enough to do it. Recognize when is it appropriate to break up, to end a relationship. What is the definition kind of a healthy relationship? If you don't have trust and respect, what are you working on? Is it just base biological attraction and fucking? That's not going to last long. And not be particularly healthy. And know what those good social boundary triggers are for terminating relationships, whether they're with family, and I mean like parents or mothers or fathers, with siblings, with friends, with external family, within intimate relationships. When is it appropriate to end a relationship? And to acknowledge those sort of things. The other is quite honestly, knowing that it's over. There are a lot of guys that will act out in defiance of a reality, and they will do outrageously, harmful things to themselves. They will lash out physically. They'll lash out on property. They'll make death threats. They'll, just all the typical horrible boyfriend stalker type material. Not that women won't do it. It's just that guys tend to do more damage, and therefore we get more press. And you have a feminized media that tends to only publicize when men behave abominably.
Well,
A
what's
lot of that,
funny
you could say, have a lot of problems of knowledge in it.
is even one of the things of not coming to terms with the reality. Something that I would do is I would get back together. It's
Yep.
it's like, because it feels good,
Yep.
but that the end result was always really terrible. When I did that.
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's a tough thing. And man, I'll say that what's actually not so funny, but kind of funny, is men may act out in certain ways. Usually there's so much guy, physicality, domination when they're acting out. Man, when women act out, it's usually a little bit more. There's a few more steps to it where I'd say, man, when women seek revenge, they go fucking crazy.
Well, they
man,
go crazy and they get away with it though too.
Oh, big time.
They like,
Yeah.
this is like a war campaign. They
Yeah.
lay out a fucking plan. They like enlist help. This is it's like stepping in front of a freight train.
Yeah, and they will do things to psychologically damage you, and to really lay a demon seed in your mind. And I've seen in personal experience that as well.
Oh, I've lived it. I mean,
Yeah.
and the thing is that once again, I mean, my big thing with TSL is not to cause a divide. but there's differences, and those differences are huge. And man, again, I think before the call we were talking about it a little bit. Maybe it was on a mastermind thing. We talk about this shit a lot, but um, you know, the problem with like men's issues, or I was just talking to Maria about this with there's somebody that posted something on Facebook about rape culture. You're seeing that a lot.
Yep.
Is
Yep.
It's like, man, these things are dividing people and making it an us against them, and making rules and things that have to be done, which that's not the case. Man, there is some inequality, some fucked up things happening, but enforcement of a societal rule, I really disagree with, because that's where we stop interacting personally. We stop recognizing that our individual strengths, our individual connections are the most important thing. Bottom line is my relationship with somebody is dependent upon me and that other person, you know, and if and we make the rules. That goes for sex, that goes for how we talk, that goes for what's fair, and all that sort of stuff. And what we see with this men's rights stuff and this women's rights stuff is these people are fucking dividing so much, and it really pisses me off. What upsets me even more is like when every single one of my female friends says they're a feminist, and they're normal. They're
Yeah.
not the whatever kind that is generally represented with like these over the top claims or whatever. But oftentimes when I bring up stuff about men, it's like, God, what the first off, women have had and still have laws that aren't so favorable for them. But man, men in prison, there's more men in prison, there's more men incarcerated. There's the expectation and pressure for men, how to be a man, all that sort of stuff. Man, we don't have any direction towards that either. What
Well, and
teaches
here's the
us
other
what
thing: is
that is?
we're also not normally allowed to talk about it. You talk about the whole pickup community was an underground reaction to a need that could not be voiced openly. And I find that terribly, terribly unhealthy.
Yeah.
For example, you have complete departments on women's studies, but to sit down and say that men have rights too tends to set off real feminists off. And most women will identify with feminism. They don't really know what it is. They don't know the tenets of it. They don't know the history. They just kind of know the ramifications of loose feminism culturally, within the mainstream. And that's not the same thing as talking to a dying-the-wool feminist. And and I've had friends that were dying-the-wool feminists, and because I cultivated, as of lately, a lot of those friendships I've had to let go because they were toxic and unhealthy. You brought up the notion of rape culture. I think, developing an awareness of rape culture is appropriate where it's honest and truthful, but where it's intentionally untruthful and damages social connections and social fabric and is designed to do just that, I've got to stand in opposition of it morally, and I tend to take an active vocal element on it. For example, I think one of the Facebook posts I said is like, there was this "Don't be that guy" campaign, talking about, if she's drunk and passed out, don't rape her. Passed out in inebriation is not consent. Well, the reality is most rapes don't occur that way. Most rapes are they know the individual. They also sit down and say that, if you look at the Department of Justice group that actually does it for sex offender management, will tell you rapists are repeat offenders. Not only that, they share a cluster of behavioral and personality traits that are consistent. Now, at no point have I ever seen a feminist organization take that information seriously and publicize it. Something that would have been highly effective is to sit down and say, okay, you got raped, report it, prosecute it, and don't let it slide. That would be effective. Okay, and because it's based in truth and effective management. But to sit down and shame every man as a potential rapist because he has a penis, that's gender biasness. That's a form of gender bigotry. And feminism, true feminism, is rampant in that.
And one of the things that I'd say too, that people should look for the solution. Man, I think so much in how we see whatever you want to call it, sexism, or even the idea of rape or rape culture, is we see the solution is to blame and demonize other people. And man, the thing is this it does nothing for the people involved. I mean, my sex life started out where I didn't get raped, but my girlfriend got kidnapped, and it was really, a fucked up thing. And the guys didn't get caught. They just recently got caught. We're talking about 16, 17 years later. And, the detective is calling me, he called me a couple weeks ago about all this witness stuff. And the thing is that, man, for a long time, for years, I had to accept that
Right.
I mean, I saw the people. I like,
Right. Yeah, it's very real to you. Yeah.
it was such and more, of course, more real to her. And, her stance is that she does want the prosecution done and all that sort of stuff. But man, everybody involved in that had to let go of it. I learned a lot about life through that and a lot about myself. And, it created a lot of chaos, whatever. But in time, it's yours. You have to own it. It's part of you. It's your responsibility to, you know, live within that and, found happiness for myself from that. The thing is that, man, demonizing people who did some like brutally like violent stuff, it was not the solution for me. It was not the solution for her. Her reason, and of course she would be better represented talking herself, but is that, she doesn't want to get out to do this again. And the
Right.
thing is that, man, we think that it's become such a blame game, that it's such a like in order to be a person. And let's fucking take the feminism out of it or the masculine men's rights stuff out of it. But so much in our society, we can't even be responsible for ourselves. So that in order to be a person and have a sense of identity and responsibility, it is somehow valued through how much we disagree with somebody, how much we can blame somebody for something, how much we can get attention drawn towards ourselves, rather than the stuff within us and how we
Right.
react to it.
Yeah,
And
we focus on the differences rather than the connections.
we see that with relationships. We see that with how people value success. And man, it's so warped. And I really think if we could just get into our identity, who we are as a person, and man, relate that, connect that real shit to another person, we'd stop giving a shit about all this Justin Bieber or, whatever sensational Miley Cyrus stuff to define us. And, that goes the same for our causes. The moment a
Right.
cause becomes more important than my actual opinion, then man, it's ridiculous. TSL is a cause that I believe in, but I live it, and it's dependent upon me being me. If I can't integrate those principles into myself and live them daily, then I have nothing to bring to the table to this group. And the same goes for everybody in this group. And that's what we unify on. Anyway, Jim,
Hmm.
what were you about to say?
Uh, I just wanted to rewind a little bit. A couple of the things that you mentioned, Sock, I think are going to be of real practical value to the greatest number of us in the short term are how to break up well,
Right.
and maybe more importantly, how to know when to go. I mean, let's take all the legal contractual obligations out of it, and long before you get to marriage, just how do you know when to go, and how do you break up gracefully?
And there isn't easy answers. I can sit down and give a list of it. If the relationship is no longer centered on trust and respect, and I focus on those two specifically. If somebody is doing something that violates trust, and I can no longer trust them, meaning that the trust was violated, and I have belief and understanding that it will continue to be violated, I don't have a relationship with that individual anymore. Okay, not a healthy one. If they're acting in disrespectful ways but are truthful, okay, and honest, and they truly are disrespectful, and I'm voiced them, and they're aware of it, and they understand the damage that is being done. If they continue to do that, I no longer have a healthy relationship. So on those two alone, I'm willing to act. Okay, and in many ways, you're not certain. Okay, that is it redeemable, and people want to cling to it because we have so much invested equity-wise already in the relationship. We've invested emotionally to the projected narrative, our accepted past narrative, and all these sort of things combined, plus the very real physical and emotional responses and values we're getting out of it. But the problem is that I also recognize when I'm in a relationship that there's being trust and respect being violated. I can't respect myself. And I have to be willing to let go of relationships in which I no longer respect myself for being in. And that may mean it's no longer an intimate relationship, that we can be friends, but I'm not going to have an intimate relationship with a woman in which I can't trust and respect, or that there's a gross continuing violation of those tenets. And so I will act on it. And now, I say that having probably been successful only a handful of times, and I say fairly recently, in the latter part of my life, and it has made a tremendous impact on the quality of my life. And for example, in the military, when I was in the Army, they tell you typically don't hear the bullet that misses you. You'll never be aware of it, but you're still alive, because of it. And I feel the same way with some of these toxic relationships. I don't need to feel the bullet's impact or the drama or the kinetic energy of where this is going to be before I'm willing to let it go. I've seen people, and I'm mentoring some people, that basically are currently experiencing that impact and are refusing to let go. And I'm like, what are you getting out of this? And that's terribly unhealthy. And in one instance, it's affecting him materially, personally, and legally at this point because of how long it's been going. I'd much rather let it go and give it time. And if the person's quality, you can reestablish the relationship and regarner that trust and respect. But where you're at now and in the path you're going and the direction you're going, I don't need to connect all the dots to paint the picture. I don't have to do a paint-by-numbers painting to understand the trajectory arc of this relationship. And if it's not going where I'd like to go or where I can respect myself, I have a responsibility of letting that go to myself.
That's great. Sock, given your level of understanding and your ability to communicate, those are really the two things that I think can be of the greatest practical use to the greatest number of men.
Yep. And that's one of the reasons why the first speech I gave. When do we go? Sorry, go ahead.
When do we go, and how do we leave gracefully?
Right. Yeah. Yep. If the first speech of the 21 convention, I speak of that at the latter half of it. It was the first time I was really publicly speaking, so there's some egregious use of the term aspect, the word aspect, and but at the latter half, I spoke directly to why and when you break up with somebody and how to do it. And, for example, I think in the talk I talked to a friend who, he was very brutal, very, very upfront. He walked up to the door of this gal that he was seeing, cared very much for, and basically said, look, and she knocked, she answered, she goes, you have the key. And he goes, yeah, I know. And he gives it to her. And he goes, I can't do this. I can't be in this relationship with you under these circumstances for the following reasons. And he goes, I love you. I miss you already, but I can't do this to you, and more importantly, I cannot do it to myself. And he basically walked up and just shot her in the head. Okay, now she knew kind of in the background things weren't right, but she was willing to coast things along and willing to ride it out in either hopes or in failure, saying, I need and demand more for myself. And it was up to him, and he felt at that time, to demand more of himself for her. Okay, and also, what he also clearly said, he demanded to have more respect for himself. And so he terminated it fairly brutally, fairly straightforward. It was cold, and he's never spoken to her again. And he had to not speak to her, because if he came back in contact with her, he would let her back in, and he knew that. And so that's awful. The hard part is recidivism of going back to the relationship.
Man,
other times you can.
I hate to do this. I gotta cut you guys short. I gotta wrap this up just because I gotta get out of here. But that all being said, you guys are more than welcome to stay on the line and talk. I mean, Sock has been on this line for 2 hours, so.
Has it been that long? I'm sitting there going, I think we're over our 20 minutes. I think we're good.
No, man. I mean, I'm basically gonna leave this up. I gotta go. I'm gonna stop recording now or here in a second.
Okay.
But how do people get in touch with you? I mean, we've talked about manningupsmart.com.
Yep. Yeah, the best way, you can contact me through manningupsmart.com, and you can email me directly through there. Luckily, the blog numbers are relatively low enough that I'm able to respond in writing to everybody who emails me. Maybe a little bit of time, but I promise I will get back to you. In many instances, it's a carry-on conversation that keeps rolling over a couple of months. That's fantastic. And that's probably the best way to do it. I try to make the responses not necessarily curt, but I try to make them meaningful as possible. And so right now I'm in a position where I can do that. So I'm more than welcome to take more conversations or emails along this line.
Cool stuff. And definitely want you back, man, if we could do this more. I mean, just because I know a lot of guys want to ask you stuff, it just means it'll be even better next time. So
right, when you leave people wanting.
Man, the TSL group is like a very affluent group of guys that questions from, it might just be like, hey, how do I get out of the house, to, how do I break up with this girl? How do I have a better sex life? Yada, yada, yada. But we all are very open people. So, man, you can bail whenever you want. I got to go. I'm going to stop recording now. I really appreciate this. This was an excellent, excellent call. And, man, thank you so much for doing this. It was really badass.
Yeah, I loved it. It was a privilege, and I'm happy to provide value back. So.
All right, guys. Steve Mayeda here. Thanks for listening. This has been a pleasure recording this. He's going to be back again. Most likely we'll be doing a video interview. Check out more from Socrates at manningupsmart.com. Also watch his videos at 21convention.com. And you can find out more about the sexual life and TSL evolution at thesexuallife.com. Thanks for listening. Enjoy.